The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, small enough to fit in my palm and heavy enough to undo 10 years of pretending I had moved on. I found it leaning against the front door of my townhouse in Portland, Maine, wrapped in brown paper with my name, written in handwriting I had spent a decade trying not to remember. Ethan Ward. No return address. No note. Just those two words tilted slightly to the right, the way Clara used to write when she was standing at a kitchen counter with one hand wrapped around a coffee mug. I stood there in my socks while the November air slipped through the open door and moved across the hardwood floor like cold water. Behind me, the kettle clicked off. My laptop was still open on the dining table, a half-finished architectural proposal glowing on the screen, waiting for the version of me who still cared about deadlines before breakfast. I should have brought the package inside, set it down, opened it like any ordinary delivery. Instead, I kept staring at the handwriting until my neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, called from the sidewalk. "Everything all right, Ethan?" I looked up too quickly and said, "Yes, just work stuff." It was not work stuff. Work stuff did not make your hands go numb. Work stuff did not smell faintly like cedar paper and rain. Inside, I placed the package on the dining table and sat across from it, as if it were a person who had come back to finish an argument. For 10 years, I had told myself Clara Bennett left because some people loved deeply but not permanently. That was the clean version. The version friends could understand over dinner. The version my sister Allison accepted after 3 glasses of wine and one long hug in my empty apartment back in Boston. The truth was messier. Clara did not leave slowly. She vanished 3 weeks before our wedding, after one phone call so short I could still recite it from memory. "Ethan, I cannot marry you. Please do not come looking for me." Then the line went dead. I went looking anyway. Of course I did. I called her parents in Vermont until her father stopped answering. I drove to her old apartment and found the place cleared out, the landlord irritated, the mailbox empty. I went to the hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse and learned she had resigned 2 days earlier. No explanation, no forwarding address, no goodbye that made sense. Just absence. For the first year, absence had a sound. It was the silence after my phone lit up with everyone except her. It was the echo in the apartment where her books no longer leaned against mine. It was the soft scrape of a wedding invitation being pulled from an envelope and dropped into the trash. By the 3rd year, people stopped asking. By the 7th, I had become good at sounding healed. By the 10th, I had convinced almost everyone. Almost. I picked up a paring knife from the kitchen and slit the tape carefully. Inside was a small navy velvet box, worn at the corners. My breath caught before I opened it. I already knew. Some objects carry their own weather. When the lid lifted, the room seemed to lose all sound. My mother's diamond sat in the center, the engagement ring I had given Clara on a snowy footbridge in Cambridge, when she laughed and cried at the same time and told me I had terrible timing because her nose was red from the cold. The ring looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had made it enormous in my mind because it was easier to hate a symbol than to grieve a person. Beneath the velvet box was a slim silver voice recorder. Not a phone, not a modern device. An old-fashioned little recorder, the kind journalists used before everything became an app. A strip of masking tape across the front had one word written on it. Listen. I sat there for a long time. The kettle cooled. The laptop dimmed. Outside, a delivery truck groaned up the street, then moved on. My thumb hovered over the play button, but my body refused to obey. 10 years is a strange amount of time. Long enough to build a new life, not long enough to stop measuring certain things against the life you almost had. I had dated after Clara. There was Megan, kind and practical, who told me after 8 months that she could feel the locked room in me and did not want to spend her life knocking. There was Rebecca, who loved hiking and hated talking about the past, which worked until it did not. I had friends. I had projects. I had a good reputation. I designed homes for families who wanted light-filled kitchens, reading nooks, mudrooms, nursery windows facing morning sun. I was very good at imagining other people's futures. I was much worse at entering my own. At noon, Allison called. I let it ring twice before answering. "You sound weird," she said before hello. "That is because you always call during work hours and accuse me of sounding weird." Deflection. What happened? I looked at the ring box. A package came. She went quiet in the way only siblings can, instantly crossing years without needing a map. From her. I closed my eyes. Hearing Clara reduced her still hurt more than it should have. I think so. What was in it? The ring. Allison inhaled softly. Ethan, there's a recorder too. Did you listen? Not yet. Do you want me to come over? I almost said no. I was 42 years old. I own a house. I could open a box without my older sister supervising my emotional collapse. But my throat tightened, and the honest answer arrived before pride could stop it. Maybe. She was there in 20 minutes, wearing her hospital badge from the clinic and carrying 2 coffees she must have bought on the way. Allison was 46, sharp-eyed, steady, the kind of woman who could calm a frightened child and intimidate a bank manager in the same afternoon. She stepped inside, saw the ring, and for once said nothing right away. She only sat beside me at the table and placed her hand over mine. You do not have to listen today, she said. Yes, I do. My voice sounded distant. If I do not, that thing is going to sit here and breathe. She nodded because she understood me too well to argue. I picked up the recorder. The plastic was cold. My thumb found the button. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then there was static, a rustle, and Clara's voice filled my dining room. Older, softer, unmistakable. Ethan, if this has reached you, then I have finally done the one honest thing I should have done 10 years ago. Allison's fingers tightened around mine. I stared at the recorder as if Clara might appear from the tiny speaker. Still, 32. Still wearing my blue shirt on Sunday mornings. Still looking at me like the world had not yet found a way to break us. The recording crackled again. Clara drew a shaky breath. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because someone convinced me that staying would destroy your life. The room tilted so quietly that nothing moved except my heart. Then Clara said a name I had not heard in years, a name that made Allison pull her hand away from mine, as if the table had burned her. It was your father. Neither of us spoke after that. The recorder remained on the table between us, its tiny red light glowing with indifferent patience, while my heartbeat drowned out everything else. My father had been dead for 4 years. He had suffered a sudden heart attack at 68, leaving behind a modest fishing cabin on the coast of New Hampshire, a collection of old photographs, and a lifetime of conversations I had assumed were complete. I had mourned him honestly. We had not always agreed, but I believed I knew the measure of the man who raised me. Clara's voice had just cracked that certainty in half. Static filled the silence before she continued. I know you probably stopped listening the moment I said his name. I almost did too the first time he came to see me. I closed my eyes. Allison whispered, "Keep going." I pressed the recorder closer. Clara spoke slowly, as though every sentence had cost her years to gather the courage to say. It was 3 weeks before our wedding. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the children's hospital. Your father was waiting outside my apartment building. I thought he wanted to surprise us with dinner plans. Instead, he asked if we could take a walk. I could picture it too easily. My father wore the same tanned field jacket every autumn until the sleeves faded lighter than the shoulders. He always placed both hands in his pockets before saying something difficult. Clara had once joked that she could predict bad news simply by watching his elbows disappear. He told me something I never imagined hearing, she said. He told me that your mother had hidden a medical condition from your family for years. He said the same condition was hereditary. He believed you carried it too, even if you had never been diagnosed. He showed me copies of medical records. He begged me not to tell you he had shown them to me. Allison looked at me, confused. "Mom," she whispered. I shook my head. Our mother had died from ovarian cancer when I was 23. There had never been another illness. At least none that I knew of. Clara continued before either of us could speak. He said you had finally found happiness after years of taking care of everyone else. He believed that if we had children and the illness appeared again, you would spend the rest of your life watching another person disappear the way you watched your mother. He said you deserved freedom instead of another lifetime of fear. I could barely breathe. It sounded impossible. It also sounded exactly like the kind of burden my father would carry alone if he truly believed he was protecting someone. I argued with him, Clara said. I told him I loved you regardless of what the future might hold. He cried, Ethan. It was the only time I ever saw your father cry. He asked me to imagine what would happen if he was wrong about keeping silent and right about the disease. Then he told me something that haunted me every day afterward. The recording paused. I heard Clara inhale shakily before repeating words that no longer belonged to her. If you love my son more than you love being his wife, you will let him hate you. Allison covered her mouth. I stared at the hardwood floor until the grain blurred beneath tears I had not expected to shed. My father had always believed sacrifice was measured by silence. When my mother was dying, he had smiled through chemotherapy appointments, insisting everything would be fine even after doctors left the room shaking their heads. He never wanted the people he loved to carry his fear. Had he truly believed abandoning my future was another form of love? Clara continued. I asked him if he knew any of this. He said no. He made me promise never to mention the conversation. I should have refused. I should have come straight to you. I know that now. But I believed him because I trusted him. Almost as much as I trusted you. The recorder clicked softly as though she had set it down for a moment before speaking again. I went home and stared at our wedding invitations for hours. Every envelope already had a stamp. Every guest had already said yes. I imagined our children. I imagined hospital rooms. I imagined watching you lose another family. I convinced myself that leaving would hurt less than letting your entire future collapse. My chest tightened until every breath felt borrowed. For 10 years, I had believed Clara chose a different life. I had cursed her selfishness during lonely birthdays and quiet Christmas mornings. I had repeated that story until even I believed it. Now another version sat before me, one that made neither of us villains, only frightened people making impossible decisions based on a lie or perhaps a misunderstanding. Allison finally broke the silence. This cannot be true. I do not know anymore, I admitted. She stood abruptly and walked toward the living room window. Dad never said anything. Not once. What do you have? She turned back toward me. No, we both knew the answer. Keeping unbearable truths to himself had practically been his religion. I pressed play again. Clara's voice sounded older now, wearier, as though the years between us were finally audible. For months after I left, I waited for relief. It never came. Every morning, I expected to wake up believing I had saved you. Instead, I only discovered that guilt grows quietly. It settles into ordinary days until even buying groceries reminds you of someone who used to reach for the same cereal box. I smiled despite myself. Every Saturday morning, Clara had insisted that expensive granola was worth every dollar because breakfast deserved optimism. I used to tease her for treating cereal like a philosophy. The memory arrived so vividly that it hurt. I watched your career from a distance, she continued. Architecture magazines, charity interviews, community projects. I knew when you moved to Maine because your firm won an award for restoring historic homes. I celebrated every success you never knew I witnessed. I also noticed one thing that frightened me. My hands tightened around the recorder. You never married. I laughed once, quietly and without humor. No, I whispered to the empty room. I did not. Clara continued. I told myself that meant nothing. People choose different paths. But every year that passed made my silence feel less like protection and more like theft. I stole your right to decide whether the future was worth facing together. Allison sat beside me again. Neither of us moved. Outside, rain had begun tapping gently against the windows, soft enough to sound almost polite. Clara spoke one final sentence before the recording ended with another burst of static. There is much more you deserve to know, Ethan, but before I explain everything else, you need to learn whether the story your father believed was ever true at all. I did not sleep that night. After Allison finally went home, I replayed Clara's recording so many times that every pause and every breath became familiar. By sunrise, the words had stopped sounding like a confession and started sounding like evidence. If my father had truly believed I carried a hereditary illness, there had to be record somewhere. There had to be a beginning before the ending Clara had been forced to live with. I called my office before 7 in the morning and told my assistant I would be taking personal leave for a few days. She sounded surprised. In 15 years, I had canceled work only twice, once for my father's funeral and once after emergency surgery to remove my appendix. "Everything all right?" she asked. "I honestly do not know," I answered. An hour later, I was driving south through the cold November rain toward Concord, New Hampshire, where my father's attorney had handled his estate. The windshield wipers moved steadily, pushing away water that always seemed to return before the next stroke. It felt strangely appropriate. Memories worked the same way. I had spent years sweeping mine aside, only to watch them come rushing back stronger than before. Every mile brought another image of my father into focus. He teaching me to cast a fishing line before sunrise. He standing quietly in the back row during my college graduation because he hated attention. He insisting that a man's character was measured by the promises he kept when nobody was watching. None of those memories matched the man Clara described. Yet none of them erased the possibility that he had believed he was protecting me. Mr. Leonard Briggs greeted me with visible surprise when I walked into his office. He had retired officially 2 years earlier, but still came in 3 mornings each week to help longtime clients. His silver hair had thinned since the funeral, but his handshake remained firm. "Ethan," he said warmly, "I wish we were meeting under happier circumstances." "So do I." He led me into his office and poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting across from me. "How can I help?" I hesitated. Everything about my question sounded irrational. Did my father ever leave anything unopened? Any letters? Medical files? Anything he asked you to hold? Mr. Briggs frowned thoughtfully. "Why do you ask?" I looked out the window before answering. "Something happened yesterday. Something that made me realize there may have been parts of my father's life I never understood." He remained silent for several seconds. Then he stood, unlocked a tall wooden cabinet, and removed a thin gray file folder. I almost forgot about this. My pulse quickened. He placed the folder carefully on the desk. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable block handwriting, were 6 simple words. "Deliver only if absolutely necessary." He gave this to me 6 months before he died, Mr. Briggs explained quietly. He never told me exactly what was inside, only that if you ever came looking for answers instead of paperwork, I should give it to you. My hand suddenly felt too large to hold something so small. Inside the folder was a sealed envelope addressed to me and another addressed to someone named Dr. Margaret Lawson. There was also a folded newspaper clipping dated nearly 12 years earlier. The headline read, "Regional Laboratory Issues Correction After Rare Testing Error." I unfolded the article slowly. It described a private diagnostic laboratory that had mistakenly mixed patient samples during a short period following a refrigeration system failure. More than 60 families had received incorrect genetic screening results before the error was discovered months later. I read the article twice before looking up. "Do you know anything about this?" Mr. Briggs shook his head. "Nothing beyond what your father mentioned once." He said mistakes made by good people sometimes lived longer than the truth. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard myself ask the next question. "Did he ever mention Dr. Lawson?" "She was a genetic specialist at Massachusetts General Hospital, if I remember correctly. Your father met with her several times after your mother's illness." I stared at the unopened envelope. If the article meant what I thought it meant, then everything Clara sacrificed might have been built upon a medical error. I thanked Mr. Briggs and carried the folder back to my car without opening the letter. Somehow it felt wrong to read my father's final words in a parking lot. Instead, I drove another 40 minutes east until I reached the old fishing cabin where he had spent every autumn after my mother died. The place overlooked a quiet lake surrounded by pine trees already stripped bare for winter. I unlocked the door with the same brass key I had carried since college. Nothing had changed. His flannel jacket still hung beside the entrance. A half-finished crossword puzzle remained folded on the coffee table. His reading glasses rested exactly where he had left them, as though he had simply stepped outside to check the weather. Grief has strange timing. I had cried at his funeral because I lost my father. Standing inside that silent cabin, I cried because I realized I might never truly know him. I sat in his worn leather chair and finally opened the envelope. The first line stole the air from my lungs. "My son, if you are reading this, then the truth I prayed would remain buried has finally found its way back to you." I read on. He wrote that after my mother died, he had secretly undergone genetic counseling because doctors believed there might be a hereditary condition affecting our family. Initial laboratory reports suggested I could have inherited the same mutation. My father admitted that fear consumed him. Before any follow-up testing could be completed, he convinced himself that protecting my future meant preventing me from building a family that might suffer the same loss. Then came the sentence that made everything inside me stop. Several months after Clara disappeared, the laboratory contacted him to report that my original genetic screening had been incorrect. My sample had been confused with another patient's during the same testing error described in the newspaper article. Follow-up analysis showed I did not carry the mutation at all. My father wrote that he immediately tried to find Clara, but by then she had vanished without leaving any address. He confessed that shame kept him from telling me what he had done. Every year afterward, the silence became harder to break until it eventually became impossible. The final paragraph was stained, as though a drop of water had fallen onto the paper before the ink dried. Whether it had been rain or tears, I could not tell. I only know the last words blurred before my eyes. I never stopped hoping that somehow both of you would discover the truth after I was gone, because I no longer believed I deserved to be the one who brought you back together. I lowered the letter into my lap. 10 years. 10 years of loneliness. 10 years of birthdays missed, children never born, futures abandoned. All because one frightened father trusted the wrong report and believed love sometimes required irreversible sacrifice. The cabin was silent except for the wind brushing softly against the pine trees outside. Then my phone vibrated. The screen displayed a number I did not recognize. I almost ignored it until a text message appeared beneath a missed call. "Ethan, this is Margaret Lawson. I received a package from your father's attorney this morning. If you have opened yours, we need to speak today. There is something Clara still does not know." I read the message 3 more times before I believed it was real. Dr. Margaret Lawson, the same name my father had written on the unopened envelope. The same woman who had apparently received her own package that very morning. I called the number immediately. She answered before the first ring had fully ended. "Ethan." Her voice carried the careful steadiness of someone who had spent a lifetime delivering difficult news. "Yes. Have you read your father's letter?" Every word. A quiet breath escaped through the phone. "Then I think we should meet in person. Some conversations deserve chairs instead of telephones." By early afternoon, I was driving toward Boston under a gray sky that threatened snow. Massachusetts General Hospital had changed since the last time I visited my mother there almost 20 years earlier. New buildings stood beside familiar brick walls, but the feeling remained the same. Hospitals carried their own language of quiet footsteps, lowered voices, and people waiting for answers they could not control. Dr. Lawson greeted me in a small consultation room rather than her office. She was in her early 70s now, with silver hair neatly pulled back and gentle blue eyes that somehow managed to look both professional and deeply human. She stood as I entered and offered her hand. "I've wanted to meet you for many years," she said softly. "I only wish it had happened under different circumstances." We sat across from one another. Between us rested 2 folders, both old enough that the edges had begun to curl. She looked at me carefully before speaking again. "Your father carried an extraordinary amount of guilt. Did he tell you what he did?" She nodded slowly. Eventually, she opened one of the folders and removed several medical reports. "When your mother became ill, genetic screening was still developing rapidly. The laboratory error that affected your testing was rare, but it happened. Your father received the incorrect preliminary report before we completed confirmation testing." I swallowed hard, and he believed it. Completely. She folded her hands together. I tried to convince him to wait for the final analysis before making any life-changing decisions. He agreed during our appointments. Unfortunately, fear often moves faster than reason. My father's face filled my mind. Not the father who laughed while teaching me to drive, but the widower who had watched his wife slowly disappear inside hospital rooms. Fear had already rewritten his life once. Perhaps he believed he was preventing history from repeating itself. When did you learn the first report was wrong? I asked. About 4 months later. We immediately contacted your father. By then, she hesitated. Clara had already disappeared. I looked down at my hands. He wrote that he tried to find her. He did. Dr. Lawson's voice grew quieter. More than once. She reached into the second folder and placed several photocopies on the table. They were requests sent to nursing boards, forwarding inquiries, returned letters, and handwritten notes documenting phone calls. Every page carried my father's signature. Every page ended with another dead end. He never stopped blaming himself, she said. He visited me every year after that. Sometimes he asked if there was any ethical way for me to contact Clara through hospital records. There was not. I stared at the stack of papers in silence. For 10 years, I had believed my father accepted what happened. Instead, he had been searching through the same darkness I had, only carrying a secret that made every step heavier. Why did he never tell me? I whispered. Dr. Lawson answered with painful honesty. Because shame has a way of convincing good people that confession would only create more suffering. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, she slid a smaller envelope toward me. This is why I asked you here. The envelope was addressed in my father's handwriting. Dr. Margaret Lawson. Open only if Ethan comes looking for answers. May I? She asked. I nodded. She carefully unfolded the single page inside. Richard asked me to read this only in your presence if the day ever came. She looked down and began reading aloud. Margaret, if my son is sitting with you, then the truth has finally reached him. I suspect he will want to find Clara. I hope he does. But before he does, there is something he deserves to know that I never had the courage to say while I was alive. The greatest mistake I made was not believing in their love. I believed fear was stronger than love because fear had already taken my wife. I forgot that love deserves the chance to choose its own future. My eyes burned. Dr. Lawson paused briefly before continuing. Please tell Ethan that Clara came back once. My head snapped upward. What? She looked at me with unmistakable sadness. About 6 years ago, my heart began racing again. She came here. She came looking for me. The room seemed to shrink around us. She had finally learned there had been a laboratory error. She wanted to know whether your father had known before she disappeared or learned afterward. What did you tell her? The truth. That he discovered the mistake months after she left and spent years trying to find her. I leaned forward. Then why did she never contact me? Dr. Lawson closed the letter gently before answering. Because she believed you had rebuilt your life. I stared at her in disbelief. How could she possibly think that? Dr. Lawson reached into the folder one last time and removed a folded photograph. It showed me standing outside one of my completed restoration projects, smiling beside a woman. My arm rested lightly around her shoulders. Recognition came instantly. Megan, my former girlfriend. The picture had been taken during a charity fundraiser nearly 7 years earlier. It had appeared in a local magazine beneath a headline celebrating community housing projects. Clara found this article, Dr. Lawson explained. She assumed she was looking at your wife. My chest tightened painfully. She never asked. She believed asking would risk destroying the happiness she thought you had finally found. I closed my eyes. Another silence. Another sacrifice built on another misunderstanding. 2 people had spent 10 years protecting each other from lives that neither of them was actually living. Dr. Lawson gently placed the photograph back into its envelope. There's one more thing. I looked up. Clara did not leave a forwarding address when she visited me. She only left instructions. Instructions? She said if you ever came searching, and only if you came searching, I should give you this. She opened a desk drawer and removed a small cream-colored envelope that had yellowed slightly with age. Across the front, written in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, were 4 words that made every breath catch in my throat. For Ethan, if he still remembers. I held the envelope for nearly a full minute before I opened it. The paper felt fragile, softened by time, as though it had absorbed every year it had spent waiting for this moment. My fingers hesitated at the seal. For the second time in 2 days, my entire future seemed to fit inside a single folded page. Dr. Lawson remained silent, giving me the space to decide when I was ready. Finally, I unfolded the letter. Clara's handwriting flowed across the page exactly as I remembered, graceful and slightly slanted, each sentence written with deliberate care. If you are reading this, Ethan, then something extraordinary has happened. It means you chose answers over anger. I always hoped that was the man you would remain, even if I was no longer part of your life. I swallowed hard and kept reading. I came here today because I finally learned that the laboratory made a mistake. For 6 years, I believed I had destroyed our future to protect you. Today, I learned that I destroyed it for nothing. I have imagined this moment thousands of times, but now that it is real, I do not know whether I deserve to stand in front of you again. My vision blurred. I blinked several times before continuing. I saw a magazine article about your housing project last year. You were smiling beside a beautiful woman. She looked happy. You looked peaceful. I told myself she must be your wife. I decided that if I truly loved you, I would not walk back into your life simply to satisfy my own guilt. I closed my eyes. One photograph, one mistaken assumption, another decade quietly disappearing because two people kept choosing silence over uncertainty. Clara continued, "If I am wrong, if she was not your wife, then I have made another terrible mistake. But if I am right, please burn this letter after reading it. Let it be the final thing I ever ask of you. Keep your happiness. Do not trade it for a ghost." A tear landed softly on the page. I quickly wiped it away before the ink could smear. There is one truth I can no longer carry alone. I never stopped wearing your engagement ring. I only took it off this morning because I finally accepted that it belonged to your future, not my past. If somehow life ever gives us another chance to speak, I will answer every question honestly. Until then, I hope you build the family we dreamed about together, even if I am only grateful enough to imagine it from far away. The letter ended simply. With all the love I was too afraid to keep. Clara. The room remained perfectly still. Dr. Lawson quietly slid a box of tissues across the table without saying a word. I laughed softly through the tears. She thought Megan was my wife. Dr. Lawson nodded. She mentioned the article several times. I try not to make assumptions about your life because I believe that conversation belonged to the two of you, not to me. And now, she met my eyes. Now I believe unfinished stories deserve the chance to finish themselves. I folded Clara's letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Do you know where she lives? Dr. Lawson hesitated for the first time since I had arrived. I did not. Not until yesterday. My heart skipped. She opened a drawer and removed a small index card. When I received your father's package yesterday morning, I knew I could not keep waiting. I searched my old patient correspondence files. Clara updated her mailing address 3 months ago. She turned the card toward me. Asheville, North Carolina, a quiet neighborhood on the western edge of the city. My pulse quickened, so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the table. Asheville, nearly 1,000 miles away. For 10 years, the distance between us had been measured in unanswered questions. Now, it had become a place I could find on a map. Does she know you found me? I asked. No. Has she contacted you since leaving the recorder? No. Dr. Lawson studied me carefully before continuing. Ethan, before you decide what to do next, there is something you should consider. I looked at her. The Clara you remember no longer exists. Neither does the Ethan she remembers. 10 years changes people, even when love remains. I nodded slowly. I know. Do you? She asked gently. Because sometimes people spend so much time mourning the life they lost that they forget to meet the people they have become. Her words stayed with me long after I left the hospital. Instead of driving straight home, I wandered through Boston for hours. Familiar streets carried unfamiliar feelings. I passed the little Italian restaurant where Clara and I celebrated when I received my architect's license. The bookstore where she always insisted on buying used novels, because she liked stories that had already belonged to someone else. The public garden where we once argued for 45 minutes over whether we wanted children before laughing, because we realized we had accidentally planned their names before agreeing to have them. Every memory felt untouched, preserved like photographs inside sealed glass. Yet I no longer saw only what I had lost. For the first time, I also saw what fear had stolen from both of us. As evening settled over the city, Allison called. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. Everything changed again. I told her about the laboratory error, my father's letters, Clara's mistaken belief about Megan, and finally the address in Asheville. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she remained silent for several seconds. "You're thinking about going?" "Yes. Today." I looked through the windshield at the fading light beyond the Charles River. "I do not know." "Ethan." Her voice softened. "Do not go because you miss the life you imagined. Go only if you are ready to meet the woman who actually exists." I smiled sadly. "You sound like Dr. Lawson." "Good. That means she is smart." After we hung up, I remained parked beside the river until darkness covered the water. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification from my assistant. I almost ignored it before noticing the subject line. "Urgent. Someone has been asking for you." Confused, I opened the message. She had attached a photograph taken by the receptionist that afternoon. A woman stood in the lobby of my architecture firm in Portland, wearing a dark wool coat and holding an empty velvet ring box. The security camera image was slightly blurred, but I recognized her instantly. Older, more tired around the eyes. Still unmistakably Clara. Beneath the photograph, my assistant had typed a single sentence. She would not leave her name. She only asked if you were still the kind of man who listened before judging. I stared at the security camera photograph until the screen dimmed. My assistant had captured the image only a few hours earlier. While I had been sitting in Dr. Lawson's office, finally learning the truth about the past, Clara had been standing in the lobby of my firm, wondering whether I still worked there. We had crossed the same day from opposite directions without knowing it. The irony was almost unbearable. I called the office immediately. My assistant, Natalie, answered on the second ring. "Ethan, tell me everything." She needed no explanation. The woman, "Yes." She came in just after lunch. She was polite. Nervous, I think. She kept looking toward your office door, like she was deciding whether to leave. "Did she say anything?" "Only that she was an old friend." I closed my eyes. "How long did she stay?" "Maybe 10 minutes. Natalie hesitated. She almost walked out twice. Then she asked if you still designed every house yourself. I smiled sadly. That sounded exactly like Clara. She used to tease me that I never trusted anyone else with the final sketch because every home felt personal. "What did you tell her?" "That you still reviewed every project before construction." Another pause. She smiled when I said that. "Did she leave anything?" "No. But what?" Before she walked out, she looked at your photograph from last year's Community Housing Award. My heart tightened. The same photograph that had convinced her years ago I was married. Natalie continued. "She asked whether the woman beside you worked for the company." I sat perfectly still. "You told her?" I laughed and said Megan had moved to Seattle years ago after getting married. My breath caught. How did she react? She did not say anything. She just thanked me and left. I leaned back against the driver's seat. Somewhere between Portland and Boston, the misunderstanding that had survived 7 years had quietly disappeared because of one receptionist answering an ordinary question. Natalie spoke again, more softly. This time, "Who was she, Ethan?" I watched the lights reflecting across the river. Someone I thought I would never see again. After ending the call, I remained motionless for several minutes. Clara now knew Megan had never been my wife. She knew I had been alone all along. She had my address. She had already returned the ring. She had already left the recording. She had already walked in my office and turned around before I came home. For the first time in 10 years, neither of us was hiding behind a misunderstanding. Only fear remained. I drove back to Portland through the night, arriving just before midnight. The house felt different as soon as I stepped inside. The recorder still rested on the dining table beside Clara's letter. Everything was exactly where I had left it, yet nothing felt the same. I wandered into my study, intending to sleep for a few hours before deciding what to do next. Instead, I noticed something I had ignored for years. On the highest shelf sat a small wooden box. Inside were the few things I had never thrown away. Our wedding invitation, 2 movie ticket stubs from our first date. A pressed maple leaf Clara had slipped in my notebook during a hike in Vermont. At the bottom lay an old disposable camera we had taken on our final vacation together to Bar Harbor. I had completely forgotten about it. The film had never been developed. The label from the pharmacy was still attached. Developed within 12 months for best quality. I laughed quietly. We had missed that deadline by almost a decade. The next morning, instead of driving to North Carolina, I found myself standing inside one of the few photography shops in Portland that still processed old film. The owner, a gray-haired man named Victor, examined the camera with obvious delight. "You do not see many of these anymore," he said. "Can you develop it? If the film survived, yes." "How long?" "A few hours." I left the camera with him and walked aimlessly through the city. Waiting had become strangely familiar. By afternoon, Victor called. "You should come back." His voice revealed nothing. I arrived 20 minutes later. He handed me a small envelope containing 12 photographs. Most were exactly what I expected. Clara standing barefoot on a rocky shoreline, laughing because the Atlantic water was colder than she expected. Me burning pancakes over a tiny cabin stove while she pretended to photograph a gourmet breakfast. A blurry sunset. A seagull stealing half our lunch. Then I reached the final photograph. My hands froze. It showed Clara sitting alone on the porch outside our rented cabin. She was writing in a notebook, unaware I had taken the picture. Behind her, resting on the wooden railing, was a small white envelope addressed in bold handwriting. "Ethan." I stared at it in disbelief. I remember that notebook. Clara wrote in it every evening during the trip, but I had never seen that envelope before. Victor noticed my expression. "Everything all right?" I pointed at the photograph. "Can you enlarge this?" "Just the envelope?" "Yes." 40 minutes later, he handed me the enlarged print. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Ethan, open on our 10th anniversary." I felt the blood drain from my face. Our 10th anniversary would have been 6 months after she disappeared. She had planned something long before everything fell apart. She had expected us to reach that day together. Whatever had happened with my father, whatever fear had entered her life afterward, it had come after this photograph was taken. She had been building a future, not planning an escape. My phone rang before I could think another thought. "Allison, where are you?" she asked. "At a photo shop." "Then finish up and come home." Her voice sounded unusually tense. "Why?" She exhaled slowly. "Because there's a woman sitting on your front porch." My heart stopped. "Is it Clara?" "Yes." Allison paused before adding the words that made every mile between us suddenly feel impossible. "She's been there for almost 2 hours. She told me she is not leaving this time, even if it takes all night for you to come home." I drove home faster than I should have, but not recklessly. 10 years had taught me that rushing rarely changed the ending. Still, every traffic light felt personal, every slow-moving truck an obstacle placed between 2 versions of my life. By the time I turned onto my street, dusk had settled over the neighborhood. Porch lights glowed warmly against the cold November evening. My house stood exactly where it always had, familiar and steady. But the woman sitting on the front steps transformed it into a place I had never seen before. Clara looked up the moment my headlights swept across the driveway. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Distance had changed her in ways photographs never could. Her hair was slightly shorter, touched with faint strands of gold from the afternoon light. Fine lines rested gently around her eyes, not from age alone, but from years of smiling less than she once had. She wore a navy wool coat and held her hands together tightly in her lap, as though letting go might cause her to disappear again. I stepped out of the truck, but forgot to close the door behind me. She stood slowly. We remained several feet apart, close enough to recognize every familiar detail, far enough to feel like strangers. Fun. Her voice carried the same warmth I had heard on the recorder, softened by years I could never reclaim. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. For 10 years, I had imagined this meeting. In some versions, I walked away. In others, I demanded explanations. Sometimes I embraced her before she spoke a word. Reality was quieter than every fantasy. We simply looked at each other, two people trying to recognize the lives hidden behind older faces. Finally, I managed a single sentence. "You waited." She smiled faintly, though tears already shimmered in her eyes. I've been late for almost 10 years. 2 more hours did not seem like much. I laughed despite myself. The sound surprised both of us. It was the first thing that felt familiar. Allison stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 untouched mugs of coffee. She glanced at me, then at Clara. "I think my job here is finished." She squeezed my shoulder gently before walking to her car. As she passed Clara, she stopped for just a moment. "I was angry with you for a very long time," Allison admitted quietly. "Today I learned I was angry at the wrong story." Clara lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Allison nodded once. "I know." Then she drove away, leaving the silence to us. I unlocked the front door. "Would you like to come inside?" Clara hesitated. "Only if you are sure." "I'm sure we should stop talking on my porch." A small smile crossed her face. "That sounds like you." The house felt strangely unfamiliar with her inside. She paused in the entryway, quietly studying the framed photographs, the bookshelf, the dining table where the recorder still rested. Her gaze stopped there. "You listened?" "Many times." She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. We sat across from one another at the same table where I had first opened the package. Between us lay the ring, the recorder, her letter, and my father's letter. It looked less like a conversation and more like 10 years arranged in careful rows. Clara looked at my father's handwriting and whispered, "I never wanted you to hate him." I looked at the letter. "I do not." She seemed genuinely surprised. "After everything?" "I think he was a frightened man who made a terrible decision because he loved us both." Tears filled her eyes again. "That is exactly how I remember him." We sat quietly before she finally spoke again. "Almost came back 100 times." I believed her immediately. "What stopped you?" She looked toward the window, where rain had begun falling softly against the glass. "The first year, guilt. The second year, shame. After that," she smiled sadly, "time becomes its own prison. Every year you stay away makes returning feel more impossible." I understood that better than I wished. "When did you learn the truth?" "About 7 years ago." I frowned. 7. She nodded. "When Dr. Lawson told me the laboratory had made a mistake." "Why did you not find me then?" She looked directly into my eyes. "Because I saw that photograph." "Megan." I shook my head gently. "She was never my wife." "I know now." Clara laughed softly through tears. "When your receptionist told me yesterday that she had married someone else years ago, I almost sat down in your lobby because my knees stopped working." For the first time since she arrived, we both laughed together. It lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the unmistakable rhythm of 2 people who had once known exactly how to make each other smile. Then the laughter faded, replaced by something quieter. Clara reached in her handbag and removed a worn leather notebook. "I want to show you something." She placed it carefully on the table. I recognized it instantly. The same notebook from Bar Harbor. The one from the photograph I had developed that morning. "You still have it." I could never throw it away. She opened to the final pages. Every entry ended abruptly 3 weeks before our wedding. Then she turned to a folded envelope tucked into the back cover. Across the front, in her handwriting, were the same words I had seen in the enlarged photograph. "Ethan, open on our 10th anniversary." She handed it to me. "I wrote this before your father came to see me." My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. It was full of plans. Dreams about children whose names we had never settled on. A promise to travel every autumn because that was when we had first met. A joke about how I would still be incapable of keeping houseplants alive 10 years later. Near the end, she had written, "If we are lucky enough to read this together one day, I hope we laugh about all the things we worried would matter. I hope we discover that ordinary mornings beside each other became the greatest adventure of all." I could not finish the last paragraph aloud. Clara quietly reached across the table. For the first time in 10 years, her hand rested gently over mine. Neither of us pulled away. She looked at me with a mixture of hope and heartbreak that words could never fully carry. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me tonight," she whispered. "I am here because for the first time in 10 years, every lie has finally disappeared." Whatever happens after this should belong to the truth. Before I could answer, someone knocked softly at the front door. We both turned toward the sound. It was nearly 9 o'clock. I opened the door to find an elderly woman standing beneath a black umbrella. She introduced herself quietly. "My name is Eleanor Brooks. I bought your father's fishing cabin last spring." She held out a small wooden box. "The contractors found this hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It has both your names written on it, and I think your father wanted you to have it." Clara and I looked at each other before I accepted the small wooden box from Eleanor Brooks. It was no larger than a hardcover novel, made of dark walnut, its brass latch worn smooth by time. A faded strip of masking tape stretched across the lid. In my father's unmistakable handwriting were 5 words. "For Ethan and Clara. Together." Eleanor smiled apologetically. "The renovation crew found it beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom. I almost opened it, but then I saw the names." "Thank you," I said quietly. "You have no idea what this means." She nodded as though she understood more than she wished to explain. "Your father loved that cabin. He used to tell me that some things only make sense when people are finally ready to hear them." After she left, the house fell silent again. Clara stared at the box resting between us. "He planned this." I slowly nodded. "Maybe not exactly like this, but he hoped we would find our way back to the same room someday." Neither of us reached for the latch immediately. We had both learned that truth could rearrange a life in seconds. Finally, Clara whispered, "Whatever is inside." We opened it together. I placed my hand beside hers on the lid. We lifted it at the same time. Inside rested 3 things: a thick cream envelope, a small velvet pouch, and an old cassette tape labeled simply November 14th. I frowned. "We do not even own a cassette player." Clara gave a tiny smile. "You always kept old electronics." I laughed softly. "Apparently you remember my bad habits." "I remember all of them." Her answer carried no bitterness, only affection that had somehow survived years of silence. I opened the envelope first. It contained several handwritten pages from my father. The date at the top stopped me. 3 weeks before our wedding. He had written the letter the same night he visited Clara. "Dear Ethan and Clara, if you are reading this together, then I was wrong, and I have never been happier to be wrong." I felt my chest tighten. He had written the letter before knowing how everything would unfold. He had prepared for 2 futures, one hopeful and one tragic. The pages that followed were painfully honest. He admitted he had become consumed by fear after losing my mother. Every medical appointment, every laboratory report, every unanswered question had convinced him that protecting the people he loved required making impossible decisions for them. He confessed that when he spoke to Clara, he genuinely believed separating us would spare me unimaginable suffering. Then came a paragraph neither of us expected. "I watched the 2 of you fall in love. I saw something stronger than anything I had left after your mother died. Instead of trusting that strength, I trusted fear. If you ever read these words together, promise me one thing. Never allow fear to make choices that only love has the right to make." Clara quietly wiped away tears before I continued. The final page contained something entirely different. It was a map, hand-drawn, simple, the fishing cabin, the lake, a trail leading into the woods. One large oak tree marked with a circle. Beneath it my father had written, "If life ever gives you another chance together, start here." We looked at one another in confusion. "Start what?" Clara whispered. I unfolded the map completely. On the back was a single sentence. "The future your mother helped me prepare." My heart skipped. "Mom." We exchanged another bewildered glance before opening the velvet pouch. Inside lay 2 old brass keys attached to a faded leather tag. The tag read Cedar Hill Storage, Unit 18. Neither of us recognized the name. "Did your father ever rent a storage unit?" Clara asked. "Not that I know of." Before we could wonder further, I noticed something tucked beneath the pouch. A folded rental agreement. Cedar Hill Storage. Active. Paid automatically every year. The account had never been closed. I looked at the dates twice. My father had continued paying for that storage unit until the month before he died. Then, somehow, the remaining balance had been prepaid for another 5 years. Clara looked at me with wide eyes. He was keeping something for us. We drove to Cedar Hill first thing the next morning. The storage facility sat outside Portland beside an old industrial district. The manager, a cheerful man named Dennis, checked the paperwork before smiling politely. Unit 18 has been untouched for years. He glanced at the keys. Looks like someone finally came for it. My heartbeat echoed inside the narrow hallway as we reached the door. I unlocked it slowly. The metal shutter rolled upward with a long scrape. Neither of us spoke. The room was filled from floor to ceiling. Not with furniture, not with valuables, with our future. Shelves lined every wall. Boxes labeled kitchen, nursery, family photos, Christmas decorations. On one side stood the handcrafted oak dining table my parents had used every Thanksgiving. Against another wall rested a beautiful wooden cradle my father had built before my mother became too ill to use it for future grandchildren she dreamed of holding someday. Clara covered her mouth, unable to breathe. There were handwritten recipe cards for my mother, photo albums, family quilts, children's storybooks with notes tucked inside the covers. Every box carried careful labels written by my father's hand. For Ethan and Clara, open when needed. For your first home. For your first Christmas. For rainy Sundays. For grandchildren someday. My knees nearly gave way beneath me. My father had quietly spent years preparing a future he believed he had destroyed. Clara knelt beside the cradle, gently running her fingertips along the polished wood. Tears fell silently onto the floor. He never stopped believing we deserved this, she whispered. I could not answer. At the very back of the unit stood one final cedar, chest unlike everything else. It bore no label except a single brass plate engraved with 2 words. Open last. Together. Clara looked at me. Are you ready? I took a slow breath. I think so. We lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay dozens of sealed letters arranged in neat bundles. One bundle for every anniversary from year 1 through year 50. My father had written a letter to us for every future year of the marriage he hoped we would have. Sitting on top of them all was one smaller envelope in different handwriting. My mother's. Neither of us had noticed it until that moment. Across the front, she had written, years before, her death in elegant blue ink that had barely faded at all. To the woman who will one day love my son as deeply as I already know she will. I looked at my mother's handwriting for a long time before I opened the envelope. I had not seen those graceful blue letters since sorting through her recipe books after the funeral almost 2 decades earlier. Clara stood beside me in complete silence, giving me the space to take the first breath. Then I carefully unfolded the single sheet inside. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the ink remained beautifully clear. To the woman who will one day love my son as deeply as I already know she will. We have probably never met. Perhaps we never will. But if this letter has found you, then life has already given my son something I prayed for every night after learning I was ill. I do not hope you make him successful. He already works too hard. I do not hope you make him perfect. He worries too much about disappointing people. I only hope you remind him that he deserves to be loved on ordinary Tuesdays, when there is nothing to celebrate and nothing to fix. My vision blurred before I reached the second paragraph. He will pretend he is stronger than he feels. He learned that from his father. Please forgive them both for believing silence is a form of protection. The Ward men have generous hearts and terrible habits. If you ever discover that Ethan is carrying pain alone, sit beside him until he remembers he does not have to. Clara quietly laughed through tears. She already knew you. Better than I know myself, I whispered. We continued reading together. If you are reading this because life has not unfolded the way any of us hoped, then remember something important. Love is not measured by the years people stay together without interruption. Sometimes it is measured by whether they find the courage to return after everything has fallen apart. Neither of us spoke after the final sentence. We simply stood in the middle of that storage unit, surrounded by the future my parents had quietly imagined for us. While my mother's words settled gently into places inside me I had forgotten were still broken. Clara carefully folded the letter and handed it back to me. Your mother was extraordinary. She would have loved you. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. I always hoped she would. We spent the next several hours opening boxes one at a time. Every shelf revealed another quiet act of hope. There were Christmas ornaments with tiny handwritten tags, identifying which stories belonged to each decoration. A complete set of children's books with notes tucked inside the covers explaining why my mother loved each one. My father's woodworking tools beside carefully cut pieces of unfinished oak labeled future bookshelves. Future dining table. Future porch swing. He had not simply stored objects. He had preserved intentions. At the bottom of one box, we found a thick leather scrapbook. The first pages contained photographs from my parents' marriage. Halfway through, the photographs ended. Blank pages stretched all the way to the back. Taped inside the front cover was another note from my father. I stopped adding photographs after your mother died. I could not bear to finish our story alone. If you two ever find this together, perhaps you can continue where we had to stop. Clara gently ran her fingers across the empty pages. He left room for us. Even after everything happened. Especially after everything happened. Her answer stayed with me. We loaded only a few boxes into my truck before sunset. Neither of us wanted to rush through what had taken my parents years to prepare. As we closed the storage unit, Dennis walked over carrying a clipboard. I almost forgot, he said. There's one more item. He disappeared into the office and returned holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Your father left instructions that this could only be released after Unit 18 had been opened. I accepted it carefully. The label read simply, Last promise. We waited until we reached my house before opening it. Inside was a polished wooden jewelry box. Resting on a velvet cushion were two wedding bands. Mine and Clara's. My breath caught. We had never exchanged them. After Clara disappeared, I had left both rings with the jeweler, unable to bear bringing them home. Somehow my father had quietly collected them without ever telling me. Beneath the rings lay one final handwritten note. If these ever find their way back into the same room, then my greatest prayer has already been answered. Whether you wear them again is no longer my decision. It never should have been. Clara stared silently at the two rings. Finally, she looked at me. I do not deserve to ask for another chance. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. Neither of us can give back 10 years. She nodded, tears slipping quietly down her face. I know, but I think we owe those years something. What? I smiled sadly. An honest beginning. We sat together until long after midnight talking about everything we had never said. There were no dramatic confessions left. Only ordinary truths. She told me about the small bookstore she eventually opened in Asheville after leaving nursing. I told her about restoring historic homes because rebuilding old places somehow felt easier than rebuilding myself. She admitted she still made blueberry pancakes every Sunday because they reminded her of our first apartment. I admitted I still bought the expensive granola she loved even though I rarely finished the box. We laughed at memories that no longer hurt quite as sharply. We cried over birthdays missed, parents buried, nieces and nephews never met, holidays spent pretending we were fine. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, the distance between who we had been and who we had become no longer felt impossible to cross. As Clara prepared to leave for the hotel, where she had booked a room, she paused at the front door. I should not stay here, she said quietly. Not tonight. I understood immediately. We had recovered the truth. Trust deserved time to grow naturally. I walked her to her car. Before getting inside, she turned toward me. For the first time in 10 years, I am not afraid of tomorrow. I smiled. Neither am I. She leaned forward and gently kissed my cheek. It lasted only a second. There was no urgency, no attempt to reclaim the years we had lost. Only a quiet promise that neither of us would disappear again. As her car pulled away, I noticed something resting on the passenger seat beside her. The old leather notebook from Bar Harbor had fallen open. Through the windshield, I caught a glimpse of one final page I had never seen before. Written across it, beneath a date from 10 years earlier, were words Clara had apparently never intended anyone else to read. If somehow life ever gives us another chance, I will not ask Ethan to forgive the woman I was. I will spend the rest of my life becoming the woman he deserved all along. The next morning felt unfamiliar in the gentlest possible way. For the first time in years, I woke without reaching instinctively for work to distract me from myself. Instead, I found my thoughts returning to a woman who was no longer a memory, but not yet fully part of my present. I made coffee, opened every curtain in the house, and stood watching pale winter sunlight settle across the backyard. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt patient. Around 9 o'clock, my phone chimed with a message from Clara. Would you like to have breakfast somewhere that does not already belong to our past? I smiled before I realized I was smiling. I know a place, I replied. We met at a small family-owned cafe overlooking Casco Bay, one neither of us had ever visited. It seemed fitting that our first meal together in 10 years belonged entirely to the present. Clara was already there when I arrived, wearing a cream-colored sweater beneath her navy coat, her hair catching the soft morning light streaming through the windows. She stood as I approached, then hesitated for half a second before giving me a brief hug. It was gentle, almost careful, as though we were both learning a familiar language again after years of forgetting its rhythm. You look better today, she said. So do you. We laughed quietly because we both knew neither of us had slept very much. Over breakfast, we did something we had not done in a decade. We talked about ordinary things. She described her bookstore in Asheville, the elderly customer who visited every Thursday only to recommend books to strangers, the rescue golden retriever named Oliver who greeted children at the front door every afternoon, and the community reading nights that had slowly become the heart of her little business. I found myself listening the way I used to, fascinated not by dramatic stories, but by the warmth she brought to simple moments. In return, I told her about restoring old homes throughout coastal Maine. I showed her photographs of a Victorian farmhouse whose original stained glass windows we had painstakingly repaired instead of replacing. She smiled exactly the way she used to whenever I spoke about architecture. You still believe old things deserve another chance, she said softly. I looked at her over my coffee cup. Apparently I do. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence that followed. It no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. After breakfast, we drove to the shoreline where waves rolled gently against weathered rocks. The air carried the clean scent of salt and pine. We walked without touching, our footsteps falling naturally into the same rhythm they once had. Can I ask you something? Clara said. Anything. Did you ever hate me? I answered honestly. For a while, I hated the story I believed about you. She nodded slowly. That is fair. But the strange thing is, I stopped walking and looked out toward the ocean. Even when I thought you had chosen someone else, I never stopped hoping you were happy. Clara lowered her head. I spent 10 years hoping the same thing for you. She smiled sadly. Turns out we were both terrible at being happy apart. We continued walking until we reached a weathered wooden bench overlooking the bay. Clara reached in her handbag and handed me a folded piece of paper. I found this inside the notebook after I left your house. I unfolded it carefully. It was a receipt from a tiny diner in Vermont dated almost 11 years earlier. On the back, written in my own handwriting, was a promise I had completely forgotten making. Whatever happens, let us promise we will always tell each other the truth before fear has the chance to speak for us. I stared at the words for a long time. I wrote this. Clara nodded. The night we talked about having children someday. I laughed softly. Apparently, I was wiser at 32 than I became afterward. No, she whispered. We both stopped recognizing ourselves after fear entered the room. Her words lingered between us. For the first time, I realized something important. We had spent 2 days uncovering the past, but almost no time discussing the future. Clara, I said quietly, what happens now? She looked out across the water before answering. I did not want to rebuild what we lost. I frowned slightly, surprised. She turned back toward me. Because we cannot. Those two people no longer exist. I slowly nodded. Then what do you want? A gentle smile appeared. I want to discover whether the people we became can still choose each other. It was the simplest answer she could have given. It was also the bravest. There were no grand declarations. No impossible promises. Only a willingness to begin again without pretending the past had never happened. That afternoon, we returned to my house and began unpacking the first few boxes from the storage unit. We placed my mother's recipe cards in the kitchen drawer. We hung one family photograph in the hallway. We laughed while reading my father's handwritten labels, especially the one attached to an unopened toolbox. For Ethan, read the instructions this time. Clara shook her head, laughing. Your father knew you very well. Unfortunately, as the afternoon faded into evening, we carried the small wooden cradle into the guest room for safekeeping. Neither of us spoke while setting it down. It represented a future that had never arrived, but somehow it no longer felt like a symbol of loss. It felt like proof that hope could survive even when time did not cooperate. Before leaving that evening, Clara paused beside the front door. I need to go back to Asheville in 2 days, she said. The words landed gently but heavily. The bookstore, my employees have been covering for me. I nodded. You built a life there. I did. She looked directly into my eyes. And you built one here. Reality quietly entered the room for the first time. Love had found its way back. Life, however, had continued moving in different directions. She stepped closer and slipped something into my hand. It was one of the 2 wedding bands we had, recovered from the cedar chest. Not the engagement ring. My wedding band. Keep it, she whispered. Not as a promise. She smiled with quiet confidence. As a possibility. I closed my fingers around the ring as she walked toward her car. This time, watching her drive away felt completely different. 10 years earlier, I had watched her disappear without knowing whether I would ever see her again. Tonight, I knew exactly where she was going. More importantly, she knew exactly how to find her way back. The next 2 days passed more quickly than either of us wanted. Clara spent her mornings helping me sort through the boxes from my parents' storage unit, and our afternoons wandering through Portland without any particular destination. We visited bookstores, waterfront cafes, and quiet neighborhoods where restored Victorian homes reminded me why I had chosen architecture in the first place. We talked about books, music, recipes, aging parents, favorite seasons, and everything ordinary that life had quietly accumulated while we were apart. It was strangely comforting to discover that love had returned without demanding constant conversation about the past. The past had finally explained itself. Now it was making room for something else. On Clara's final evening before returning to Asheville, Allison invited us to dinner at her house. No speeches, she warned over the phone. Just food. When we arrived, the dining table was already set. My nephew Liam, now 16, looked between Clara and me with the honest curiosity only teenagers possess. So, you are the Clara? Allison immediately gave him the look every older sister perfects by adulthood. Liam, he raised both hands. I was just asking. Clara laughed before anyone else could. Yes, she said. I'm a Clara. The awkwardness dissolved instantly. Dinner unfolded with unexpected ease. Allison talked about the clinic. Liam described his high school robotics competition. Clara shared stories about children who visited her bookstore every Saturday dressed as their favorite literary characters. I found myself watching her more than listening. She fit naturally into the room, not because nothing had changed, but because kindness had always belonged to her. After dessert, Allison quietly pulled me onto the back porch while Clara helped Liam clear the table. The November air carried the familiar scent of wood smoke drifting through the neighborhood. Allison folded her arms and leaned against the railing. She looks lighter. She does. So do you. I smiled. That obvious? Very. She grew quiet for a moment. Mom would have liked today. I looked through the kitchen window where Clara was laughing at something Liam had said. Dad would have too. Allison nodded slowly. Eventually, we stood together in comfortable silence before she spoke again. Do not waste time trying to recover 10 years. I looked at her. You cannot live backward. I know. Then live forward. Her words stayed with me long after we drove home. The following morning, I accompanied Clara to the airport. Neither of us pretended this goodbye was easy. We stood near the security entrance, watching travelers hurry toward flights, each carrying lives invisible to everyone around them. Clara slipped her hands into her coat pockets. This goodbye feels different. Because it is not really goodbye. She smiled. No. She reached into her handbag and handed me a small package wrapped in brown paper. Do not open it until you get home. Can I ask what it is? You can. Will you tell me? No. I laughed. Some things never change. Some things should not. The boarding announcement echoed across the terminal. She stepped closer. This time, neither of us hesitated. We embraced quietly, holding each other without trying to erase the years between us. There was sadness in the moment, but no fear. When we finally stepped apart, Clara looked directly into my eyes. Thank you. For what? For listening before judging. I remembered the words Natalie had repeated from the receptionist conversation. Somehow, without realizing it, Clara had answered her own question. Safe flight, I whispered. She nodded, then walked toward security. Halfway through the line, she turned and waved once. I waved back. Then she disappeared around the corner. I drove home through light rain, surprised to discover I was smiling instead of grieving. Missing someone felt different when you knew exactly where they were. Inside the house, I unwrapped Clara's package. It was a hardcover book, The Great Gatsby, our old copy from college, the one I thought had been lost during the move before our wedding. Inside the front cover, she had written a new inscription beneath one we had both signed 11 years earlier. We never finished the story we planned. Perhaps that is because life was writing a different one. Thank you for reading the next chapter with me. Tucked between the final pages was an airplane ticket confirmation. Not hers. Mine. Destination, Asheville, North Carolina. Departure, 2 weeks from today. Attached was a handwritten note. Only if you want to see where I learned how to begin again. I stared at the ticket for a long time before reaching for my phone. I called my office first. Natalie, welcome back, she said cheerfully. Actually, I replied, smiling toward the window, I'm going to need another week off in 2 weeks. She laughed. Should I assume this is for a much better reason than the last one? Much better. After hanging up, I called Clara. She answered almost immediately. Did you open it? I did. And I looked down at the ticket resting on the table beside both wedding bands, my mother's letter, and my father's final apology. I think I would like to see your bookstore. I heard her smile through the silence before she spoke. Oliver, the golden retriever, is going to be very excited. What about the owner? She laughed softly, the sound warm enough to cross every mile between Maine and North Carolina. She has been waiting a very long time. I looked around the quiet house. It no longer felt like a museum dedicated to everything I had lost. It felt like a place preparing to welcome whatever came next. For the first time since opening that small package on my front porch, I understood that forgiveness had never been the ending of our story. It had simply been the doorway through which hope quietly returned. 2 weeks later, I stood beneath a bright Carolina sky, holding a small suitcase and wondering why my heart was pounding harder than it. By the day I proposed, Asheville welcomed me with late autumn sunlight, tree-lined streets, and mountains fading into soft blue horizons. Everything felt slower than Maine, as though the city had quietly decided that people deserved an extra minute before making important decisions. Clara's bookstore sat on a quiet corner beneath a restored brick building with ivy climbing one side. A painted wooden sign above the entrance read Willow and Pine Books. Through the front window, I saw shelves overflowing with novels, comfortable reading chairs, children sitting cross-legged during story hour, and an elderly golden retriever sleeping peacefully beside the fireplace. Before I reached for the door, it opened from the inside. Oliver looked up first, wagged his tail enthusiastically, and walked directly toward me, as though we had known each other for years. Clara appeared behind him, carrying a stack of books. She stopped the moment our eyes met. Then she smiled, not the careful smile she wore during our first reunion in Portland, not the uncertain smile shaped by guilt and unanswered questions. This one was quiet, confident, and completely present. You made it, she said. I told you I wanted to see the bookstore. She laughed softly. I was hoping you meant more than the bookstore. I stepped inside. The scent of old paper, fresh coffee, and cedar would fill the room. A little girl, carrying a picture book, looked up at Clara. Is this your friend? Clara glanced at me before answering. Yes. She paused for only a heartbeat. A very old friend. The child smiled with perfect satisfaction and returned to her book, as though that explained everything worth knowing. Clara introduced me to her employees, showed me the reading room, the tiny cafe tucked into the back corner, and the community wall covered with handwritten notes from customers about books that had changed their lives. Every corner reflected the woman she had become. Warm, thoughtful, quietly hopeful. Later that afternoon, after the bookstore closed, we drove into the Blue Ridge Mountains. We parked beside an overlook where the valleys stretched endlessly beneath the golden light of sunset. We sat on a weathered wooden bench without speaking for several minutes. Some silences no longer needed to be filled. Clara finally broke the quiet. When I first moved here, I came to this overlook every Sunday. Why? Because I needed somewhere large enough to hold my regrets. She smiled gently. Eventually, they became memories instead. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed the 2 wedding bands my father had hidden for so many years. Clara looked at them without saying a word. I carried these all the way here, I said, not because I expected anything today. She nodded, waiting. When my father wrote that whether we wore them again should never have been his decision, I thought he was talking about marriage. I looked toward the mountains before continuing. Now I think he was talking about choice. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Ethan, we lost 10 years because other people made decisions for us. Fear made decisions for us. Silence made decisions for us. I turned back toward her. I do not want our future to begin the same way. She reached for my hand. Neither do I. I placed the rings gently between us on the bench. I'm not asking whether we can become the people we were. She smiled through tears. We cannot. Good. I laughed quietly, because I like the woman sitting beside me much more than the memory I kept chasing. She covered her face for a moment, laughing and crying at the same time. When she finally looked up again, I continued. So here's my question. I took a slow breath. Would you like to spend whatever years we have left discovering who we can become together? There was no dramatic pause, no audience, no music. Clara simply nodded, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered, more than anything. She picked up my wedding band first and gently slipped it onto my finger. Then she looked at her own ring for a long moment before placing it on her hand. Neither of us spoke. The moment belonged to itself. Months passed gently after that. I arranged my work so I could divide my time between Maine and North Carolina. Clara kept her bookstore. I continued restoring old homes. Eventually, we found a small, white farmhouse. Halfway between the mountains and the town, surrounded by maple trees and a wraparound porch that reminded me of the sketches I used to make years earlier. We filled it slowly with the things my parents had preserved inside the storage unit. My mother's recipes returned to the kitchen. My father's oak dining table became the center of Sunday dinners shared with Allison, Liam, Clara's bookstore friends, and neighbors who gradually became family. The old wooden cradle remained in the guest room for a long time, not as a reminder of what we had lost, but as a quiet symbol that hope did not always arrive on the schedule we expected. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after the package first appeared on my doorstep, Clara found me planting wildflowers beside the porch. She handed me a familiar leather scrapbook. The blank pages my father had left waiting were no longer empty. We had filled them with photographs from bookstores, ferry rides, mountain sunsets, family dinners, repaired homes, birthdays, quiet mornings, and ordinary Tuesdays exactly as my mother had hoped. Clara opened to the final page. There was still room for one more photograph. She held up a camera and smiled. Come here. I walked across the garden and stood beside her. Oliver settled happily at our feet. Just before the shutter clicked, Clara slipped her hand into mine. Ready? She asked. I looked at the woman I had loved, lost, forgiven, and found again. Then I looked toward the home built from second chances, the table my parents had saved, the flowers beginning to bloom, and the future neither fear nor silence would ever choose for us again. I had been ready since the day I finally listened. The camera captured the moment, and for the first time in a very long time, our story no longer felt like something we had survived. It finally felt like the life we were living.